starting with $200,000 at age 50 and finishing with $1 million at age 65. That's a five-fold increase across a 15-year window. And right now, I'm going to walk you through exactly how that math holds up, down to the specific tax tools, expense figures, timing pitfalls, and the medical coverage expense that will hit you like a truck if you stop working even one day before Medicare eligibility begins. Most people frame this as a savings shortfall. It isn't. It's a problem of execution, and there are four very distinct points where that execution collapses. Here's the truth about being 50. The standard narrative tells you that you've missed the window, that compounding has nearly run its course, that you should scale back your ambitions and simply hope that Social Security remains intact. That narrative is false. And I can disprove it with a simple spreadsheet that takes about half a minute to build. The S&P 500 has delivered an average annual return of 10.3% over the past 3 decades. As of 2026, factoring in dividend reinvestment, $200,000 growing at 10% annually for 15 years becomes $835,000. Without a single additional deposit, without one extra dollar added, just compounding doing what it naturally does. Layer in the catch-up contributions that the tax code specifically unlocks at age 50, Mickey, contributions most people don't even realize exist, and you sail past $1 million with room to breathe. But nobody discusses the three forces that can prevent you from ever getting there. And one of them is sitting quietly inside your 401k statement right now. In just a few minutes, I'll reveal the single most important number in all of retirement planning, the one that truly determines whether your portfolio survives the first 10 years of withdrawals. Most people approaching 65 have never encountered it. But first, here's why the math that most people rely on for retirement planning is built entirely on a flawed foundation. Let me introduce a central analogy that I'll return to throughout this video. Picture an ultra-marathon runner at mile 40 of a 60-mile course. Everything required to finish is already inside them. The conditioning is built, the training is done. What actually decides whether they cross the line, and how they cross it, comes down to what happens in those final 20 miles. The nutrition choices, the pacing strategy, the judgment calls about when to accelerate and when to hold back. Blow the strategy in those final miles, and every previous mile of training counts for nothing. Execute it well, and you run the greatest race of your life. That's a perfect picture of what the financial journey from 50 to 65 looks like. The first 3 decades of your career built the foundation. You have $200,000. The finish line is $1 million. The question isn't whether enough time remains. The question is whether you understand where the accelerators are, and whether you recognize which errors will derail you before you reach 65. Let's begin with the first mile. Most people believe their retirement problem is about the dollar amount. They didn't accumulate enough. They started too late. They wish they had saved more aggressively in their 30s. That's the problem they think they're facing. But here's the reversal. The amount isn't the real problem. The behavior is. And the data on this is almost uncomfortable to look at. While the long-term average return of the U.S. stock market has been roughly 10% annually based on the S&P 500, most individual investors achieve less than half of that. A J.P. Morgan study found that the average investor earned just 2.9% per year during a period when both stock and bond returns were significantly higher. 2.9%. Let that sink in for a moment. The market returned 10% across long historical periods. The average investor captured 2.9%. That isn't a market failure. That is a behavioral failure. People buy high because rising prices make them feel confident. They sell low because falling prices trigger panic. They move money in and out trying to anticipate the next move, attempting to be clever about timing. And in doing so, they surrender 7 full percentage points of annual return. Here's what that 7-point gap actually costs in real dollars. $200,000 growing at 2.9% for 15 years becomes $312,000. $200,000 growing at 10% for 15 years becomes $835,000. The gap between those two outcomes is $523,000. Not because one person caught a lucky break and another didn't, but because one person recognized how their own psychology would work against them and built a system that removed emotion from the equation entirely. Most investors trade too frequently without fully understanding what they're doing. They buy and sell at exactly the wrong moments, fully convinced they're making smart decisions. If your goal is to earn market average returns, buy and hold stock index ETFs. Full stop. That's the first lever. Boring, unglamorous, and worth $523,000 across 15 years. But there's a second dimension to this behavioral problem, and it operates at a more subtle level. It isn't just about market timing, it's about the funds you're invested in. Because the financial services industry constructed an entire ecosystem around selling you products that charge more while delivering less. And the evidence on this is as clear-cut as anything in the world of finance. Over the 15-year period ending in December 2024, not a single U.S. equity fund category had a majority of active managers beating their benchmarks. 0 categories out of 22. That result holds even after accounting for funds that merged or were shut down entirely. 0 out of 22. And in 2025 specifically, 79% of actively managed large-cap U.S. equity funds underperformed the S&P 500, marking the 4th worst year on record for active large-cap managers across the 25-year history of the SPIVA scorecards. Think carefully about what this means for you personally. If you're currently holding actively managed funds, which most 401(k) plan menus strongly favor, there is nearly a 9 in 10 probability that a straightforward index fund would have outperformed your fund over the past 15 years. After fees, after all the research, after all the fund manager expertise and resources. The likelihood of selecting a winning actively managed fund over a 15-year stretch is roughly 1 in 10. Those are lottery ticket odds. You are not supposed to be playing the lottery with your retirement nest egg. Hit subscribe if this content is valuable to you, otherwise the platform algorithm may stop surfacing these videos to you entirely. This is the behavioral problem resolved at the structural level. Exit actively managed funds, move into low-cost index funds, and stop interfering with the process. That's the lane to run in. Now let's talk about the accelerators. Stay with me here because what comes next genuinely reshapes the picture. Turning 50 doesn't simply mean time is running short. It means the tax code has just handed you a set of instruments that weren't accessible to you at 35, and almost no one deploys them correctly. Here's what becomes available at 50. The IRS recognizes that you're close enough to retirement to warrant additional access to tax-advantaged accounts beyond what everyone else is permitted. These are called catch-up contributions, and in 2026 specifically, the figures are substantial. Your 401(k) permits an additional $8,000 per year in catch-up contributions, lifting your total allowable contribution to $32,500. Your IRA catch-up limit has been adjusted upward for inflation, allowing an additional $1,100 and a total IRA contribution of $8,600. So beginning at 50, you can channel up to $32,500 annually into your 401(k) on a completely tax-deferred basis. That money faces no tax this year. It compounds without taxation, and if you approach it strategically, it may never be taxed the way you'd conventionally expect. Let me walk through the math of adding those catch-up contributions to our $200,000 starting scenario. If you contribute just $8,000 per year in catch-up funds, on top of the $200,000 already invested, earning 10% annually for 15 years, those annual contributions alone compound to $254,000. Add that to the $835,000 generated by the base amount, and you're sitting at $1,089,000 at age 65. You've cleared $1 million without switching careers, without learning to trade derivatives, and without hoping for extraordinary fortune. You simply use the tools that the tax code specifically engineered for your age group. But there's a second lever available in this phase that carries even greater power. And almost no one in their 50s takes advantage of it. It's called the Roth conversion ladder. Here's why it matters. Most people at 50 hold the majority of their retirement savings in traditional pre-tax accounts. Their 401(k), their traditional IRA. Every dollar sitting in those accounts will be taxed as ordinary income at the point of withdrawal. If you retire at 65 with $800,000 in a traditional IRA and begin drawing $60,000 per year, you're paying income tax on every single dollar. At current rates, that could run you $12,000 to $14,000 annually in federal taxes alone. Across 20 years of retirement, that potentially adds up to $250,000 or more in taxes on money you already earned. A Roth conversion ladder is a strategy that incrementally shifts funds from a traditional IRA into a Roth IRA over multiple years. Rather than converting the full balance at once, you convert smaller amounts each year. Each conversion forms a new rung on the ladder. After 5 years, the converted amount can generally be withdrawn without taxes or penalties, provided you follow IRS guidelines. Here's how this plays out in practice. At 50, suppose you have $200,000 sitting in a traditional IRA and you're earning $65,000 per year in salary. Your standard deduction and applicable exemptions reduce your taxable income. In certain years, particularly if you carry deductible business expenses or other qualifying offsets, you might find yourself in the 12% or 22% federal tax bracket. Every dollar you convert to a Roth at those rates is a dollar that will never face taxation again. Not as it grows. Not when you withdraw it in retirement. Not when you pass it on to your children. Roth IRAs carry no required minimum distributions during the account holder's lifetime, a meaningful contrast to traditional IRAs and 401ks, where required minimum distributions must begin at age 73. This characteristic makes Roth IRAs especially appealing for those who want to preserve their retirement assets for later years or transfer them to heirs. The window between 50 and 65 represents the single most advantageous conversion opportunity most people will ever encounter. Your income may level off or even decline if you transition to part-time work. Required minimum distributions haven't started yet. You have a 15-year runway to shift money from a tax-deferred structure into a tax-free one, paying a relatively modest rate today rather than an unknown and potentially higher rate later. That's two levers, behavioral discipline combined with strategic structure, forming a freight train, gaining momentum. Now I want to describe someone I had in mind while developing this content. Let's call him Robert. Robert is 52. He spent 22 years at the same corporation, consistently maxed out his 401k, and invested everything in the target date fund his HR department pointed him toward. On paper, Robert did everything correctly. He has $230,000 accumulated. He's satisfied with his progress. He expects to retire at 65. What Robert hasn't discovered yet, and won't for another 3 chapters of his story, is that 3 specific forces have been quietly working against him the entire time. I'll return to Robert. Here's where the analysis becomes genuinely fascinating, and where the math referenced in this video's premise starts making complete sense. Because even if you resolve the behavioral problem and utilize the catch-up contributions, there's a third force actively eroding your position that most retirement calculators never surface. And it isn't market risk, it's a structural tax on your wealth hiding in broad daylight. Fees. I've operated my own business for over a decade, surrounded by accountants and financial attorneys. I have several $100,000 invested personally, and even with that context, the true cost of fee drag took considerable time to fully absorb, because the numbers are expressed as percentages rather than dollars. And percentages are psychologically invisible. Let's make them visible. $200,000 at 10% annually for 15 years becomes $835,000. That same $200,000 at 9% annually, just 1% lower, the kind of fee a perfectly respectable advisor might charge, grows to only $728,000. That single percentage point in fees costs you $107,000 across 15 years. That isn't a rounding error. That's more than half your original starting balance. Fee drag compounds exponentially, not in a straight line. A 0.5% fee differential sounds trivial on an annual basis, but costs approximately $59,100 over 20 years and $165,800 over 30 years on a $100,000 starting investment. The gap nearly triples between year 20 and year 30 because the compounding engine operates on an ever larger eroding base in later years. The difference between a 1% expense ratio and a 0.1% expense ratio represents a 22.4% reduction in ending wealth after 30 years, a 22.4% loss in total final wealth from fees alone, not from poor decisions, not from a market downturn, not from bad fortune, from the fee structure you selected when you enrolled. And here's what deepens the problem. Annual fees compound through multiple layers of erosion. In year 1, a 1% fee on a $100,000 portfolio costs $1,000. By year 15, that same percentage costs $2,750. By year 25, it exceeds $5,400. The percentage never shifted, but the dollar cost tripled and then quintupled. Moreover, the $1,000 taken in year 1 would have compounded for 29 additional years at 7%. That single year's fee alone represents approximately $7,100 in lost compounded returns by year 30. That's compounding working in reverse. Every dollar paid in fees today is not simply a dollar. It's whatever that dollar would have grown into over the next 15 years. And the financial industry has been very deliberate about showing you the fee as a percentage, never as a forward projected dollar figure. So let's incorporate that into the full picture. To move from $200,000 to $1 million by 65, you must simultaneously address three things: the behavioral gap, the tax architecture, and the fee erosion. Get any one of these wrong and the math unravels. Get all three right and you don't merely reach $1 million, you very likely surpass it. There's a reason for the name lazy investor. Not because of any reluctance to do the work. It's because reading the SEC filings, the SPIVA scorecards, and the retirement research consistently leads to the same conclusion. The passive approach outperforms the active approach. Don't pick individual stocks. Don't pay a manager to pick stocks. Don't trade in and out attempting to beat a market that has already priced in all available information. Buy low-cost index funds. Use the tax instruments available to you. Minimize expenses and leave everything alone. That is not laziness. That is discipline. And the outcomes reflect it. Here's something built specifically for this challenge. The part that never appears in a standard retirement calculator is the interaction between all these components. The sequence of events, the fees, the healthcare gap, the Social Security timing decision. You can understand each piece independently and still get the overall picture wrong because the pieces interact in ways that aren't intuitively obvious. That's why a digital resource called the Exit Code was developed. An analysis of 50 years of retirement data distilled into a mathematical framework for understanding precisely when and how to transition out of the working world. Two specific elements from it connect directly to what we're covering today. First, the 4% trap. Conventional wisdom holds that withdrawing 4% of your portfolio annually means you'll never exhaust your funds. The data supporting that guideline was built on specific market conditions that may or may not recur. More critically, it was designed around 30-year retirement periods. If you stop working at 60 and live to 90, you're managing a 30-year withdrawal window from the start, and the 4% rule begins looking considerably less reliable. The Exit Code walks through a dynamic withdrawal approach that adjusts your annual draw based on actual market conditions and portfolio performance each year, rather than locking in a fixed rate calculated during a different era. Second, the 58% rule. Research on early and mid-career workforce exits shows that a significant proportion of people who intend to retire at 65 are actually pushed out before that point, through corporate restructuring, health complications, or organizational changes. The buffer strategy embedded in the Exit Code specifically addresses this forced exit scenario, ensuring that if you're among that large percentage who doesn't leave on their own schedule, your financial plan doesn't collapse. You can access it for less than the cost of a single hour with a mediocre financial advisor through the link in the description. Not because it's underpriced, but because the depth of information it contains in one place is harder to find anywhere else at any price. Now, back to Robert Ita and back to the miles that almost nobody runs correctly. Robert, you'll recall, has $230,000 saved. He believes he's on course, and he might be, if not for what's approaching in mile 13 of his final 15 miles. Let me explain sequence of returns risk, because this single concept influences your retirement outcome more than almost anything else. And it only becomes relevant during the withdrawal phase, not the accumulation phase, which means it's heading directly toward you around age 65. Sequence of returns risk is the danger that poor investment performance early in retirement, combined with ongoing withdrawals, will substantially reduce a portfolio's value and limit its capacity to recover. Even when the long-term average annual return remains favorable, early losses are compounded by withdrawals that lock in those losses, leaving less capital available to benefit from subsequent gains. Here's the harsh version of this reality. Two retirees. Both have $1 million. Both withdraw $50,000 per year. Both achieve the exact same average annual return over 20 years. The only variable is the sequence in which those returns arrive. Retiree 1 experiences strong years early and weak years late. Retiree 2 experiences weak years early and strong years late. During the accumulation phase, return order is relatively inconsequential. A 20% loss followed by a 25% gain produces a roughly similar outcome as the reverse because no money is being removed. But once withdrawals begin, early losses compound in a manner that later gains simply cannot reverse. Research by Wadefau estimates that approximately 77% of a portfolio's ultimate retirement outcome is explained by the returns experienced in just the first 10 years. 77% of your retirement destiny determined in the opening decade. Not by your intelligence, not by your diligence, not by the quality of your planning, but by whether the market happened to rise or fall during the years immediately following the end of your working career. This is where Robert's story pivots. Robert exits the workforce at 62, pushed out during a corporate restructuring, not by choice. His first year of retirement coincides with a down market. Equities fall 17%. His portfolio drops from $230,000 to $191,000. He still needs to cover living expenses, so he withdraws $45,000. He's now at $146,000. The market must now rise 35% just to restore his original position. And the $45,000 he withdrew will never participate in that recovery. Sequence of returns risk concentrates most heavily in the first decade of retirement. The reason is straightforward. That is when the portfolio is largest relative to the withdrawal amounts. A 20% decline on a $1 million portfolio wipes out $200,000. The same 20% decline on a $400,000 portfolio wipes out only $80,000. In those early retirement years when the portfolio is at its peak, market downturns inflict the most damage. The defense against this isn't attempting to predict market timing. It's structural. You construct a cash cushion, 2 to 3 years of expenses held in stable liquid assets, so that when the market falls in year 1 or year 2 of retirement, you're not forced to sell equities at depressed prices. You spend your cash, you allow the equities to recover. This is the bucketing strategy, and while it isn't exotic, it requires advanced planning before retirement, not after the first down year has already arrived. Now you're probably asking yourself, even if I reach $1 million, how much can I realistically spend? And here's the element that nearly every retirement video neglects to address. The number you actually need at 65 isn't $1 million in isolation. It's $1 million minus whatever the healthcare system is preparing to charge you for the 3 years before Medicare coverage begins. Think about Robert again, leaving his employer at 62. He's been enrolled in employer-sponsored healthcare throughout his career. He was paying somewhere between $200 and $400 per month in premiums. He walks out the door at 62 and suddenly must source his own coverage for 3 full years, until Medicare eligibility begins at 65. Monthly premiums for 60-year-olds currently range from $1,400 to $1,675 depending on plan type and network. That translates to roughly $12,000 to $13,000 per year in premiums per person, capable of consuming a substantial portion of annual retirement income, particularly for households drawing down from savings or investment accounts. 3 years of private health coverage before Medicare at $12,000 to $13,000 per year in premiums alone amounts to $36,000 to $39,000. Before a single deductible copayment or prescription expense is incurred, a 2026 report by EBRI found that some couples may require up to $469,000 in total savings to adequately cover healthcare costs throughout retirement. This is the invisible bill, and it's precisely why any analysis that accounts only for investment returns is fundamentally incomplete. You're not simply building a portfolio to draw income from. You're building a portfolio to cover your actual living costs, which include one of the most expensive and fastest escalating line items in American household budgets. Here's the darkly humorous version of this scenario. A financial advisor says, "Excellent news. You have $900,000. You can retire at 62. You retire. 3 years later, your portfolio sits at $840,000. Not because of market performance, but because you wrote a $60,000 check to health insurance providers. The market moved upward, yet you're behind schedule. Robert didn't account for this, did you? Now you might be thinking, the catch-up contributions and the Roth ladder address the accumulation challenge. The bucketing strategy handles sequence risk. Healthcare costs are accounted for and budgeted. So, what's the fourth element? What's the final piece? Social Security timing. This is the decision most people get wrong, and the financial consequences of getting it wrong are both significant and irreversible. Claiming Social Security at 62 permanently reduces your monthly benefit by as much as 30% compared to your full retirement age.